Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gay Hart Gaines, and I was the Vice Regent from Florida for many years and Regent for 3. And those of you who do know me know that this is my favorite place to be in the whole world. So I'm sorry it took so darn long, and I'm sorry you had to wait. I promise it won't ever happen again. I'm out of breath. If you have a cell phone, would you please turn it off? So welcome, everybody, to the first Gay Hart Gaines lecture of American history. We have a distinguished visiting fellow with us today, Richard Brookhiser, and I can't wait to introduce him. But first, I want to tell you we have Mary Eberstadt with me, who's in the car with me. I want Mary to stand up. She's a distinguished essayist and writer and lives right in Washington. I'm so glad she could come. Laura Ingram is coming, but she's not going to make it, I don't think, because of the traffic, but she is coming. Newt also, but we're all having a hard time tonight. But anyway, as you know, this series is generously funded by Lehrman, and Lou isn't with us, but he has written a book, and his new book is Churchill, Roosevelt and Company, Studies in Character and Statecraft. And knowing what a fine writer he is and what a thorough researcher he is, I think it'll be great. And I've talked to Doug Bradburn, and hopefully we will have a book signing for him here at Mount Vernon, and I hope you'll all come, because he's been so generous over the years to Mount Vernon. And tonight we have a speaker that I'm sure most of you in this audience know well from his impressive body of work. He's a scholar, a journalist, an historian, and he's a great human being, Richard Brookhiser. I met Rick years ago when I was chairman of the National Review Institute, and I've read so many of his articles and books and followed his brilliant career with great interest. When he was a 15-year-old high school student, his very first article on the anti-war protests in his high school became the National Review cover story. Rick graduated from Yale with a BA, and instead of going to Yale Law School, where he had been accepted, and thankfully for all of us, there's enough lawyers, there aren't enough great historians, he went to work as a journalist for National Review right out of college, and at the age of 23, he was the youngest senior editor in National Review history. He's a careful researcher, a prodigious writer, and often when people ask me to recommend a book, and I know these people maybe don't know too much about American history, and say, well, Gay, if you were just going to read one book about George Washington, what would it be? I always recommend Founding Father. It's not a long book, but Rick, it has such profound insights into George Washington's character and George Washington's life. It's not only readable, you can't put it down. I started it during a hurricane in Palm Beach, and when all the lights went out, I finished that book with a flashlight. I love it. Rick suffered from cancer in the 1990s, which he heroically and thankfully successfully beat. He told me from firsthand knowledge and with great sincerity how much marijuana helped rid him of horrible nausea when he was on chemotherapy. He was one of the first people to testify in front of the Judiciary Committee about the necessary use of marijuana to help people with their nausea and pain, and he was an ardent advocate for legalizing marijuana for medical purposes. I know you're happy now that people are able to use it legally. Rick and his wife, Jean, visited us one time in late May or early June when he was recovering from his cancer, and they both were absolutely blown away one night by a fabulous female turtle who laboriously crawled up from the ocean onto the beach to lay her eggs. And they both love animals, sort of like Newt Gingrich, your particular group of people that adore prehistoric animals, and they said it was one of the highlights of their lives, this unforgettable event. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so lucky that Doug Bradburn invited Rick Brookhiser to be our distinguished visiting lecturer of American history for 2016. Thank you for being here, Mr. Brookhiser.
Thank you, Gay. Can everyone hear me? Everyone can hear me? Gay, when you arrive is on time, so don't worry about being late. To be giving the Gay Gaines lecture at George Washington's Mount Vernon is like a triple celebration of practicality. George Washington was the most practical of the founding fathers. He took on the hardest jobs and he did them all, however long they took. His mother is supposed to have said, when she was told during the war that he'd won a battle, her comment was, "George generally completes what he undertakes." And then in the 1850s, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association undertook the rescue of this beautiful and sacred spot, and they've been maintaining it ever since. And among their many excellent vice regents and regents is Gay Gaines. I have, as she said, I've known her for many years in connection with Mount Vernon and other interests of hers, and Gay gets the job done. And if you're necessary to getting the job done, she gets you to do the job also. She has indefatigable energy and endless good spirits, and it's a great honor and a pleasure to be giving this lecture. The series of lectures I'm going to be giving this fall is called George Washington and Politics. And I'm going to follow the man and the thing from the 1780s up to the Civil War, 80 years of American history. I'm going to pick up Washington on the eve of his first presidential election. I'm going to track him through his administration and his retirement, and then after his death, when he's used as an inspiration and an example by Americans. I'm also going to follow politics in that same period. And so when we started in the late 1780s, it will be strange to us. There are some things about politics that never change, how you deal with your allies, how you deal with your rivals. But the political system, the American political system in the late 1780s is not one that we recognize. But very soon it becomes so. Now, in September 2016, we're in the midst of a presidential election. If you didn't know that, I just told you. The first presidential election happened at the end of 1788 and the very beginning of 1789. Congress decreed that under the new Constitution, the states should pick electors to vote for the president, and that these electors should meet in their state capitals on the first Wednesday in January of 1789. Now, of the original 13 states, 2 could not participate because they hadn't yet ratified the Constitution. That was Rhode Island and North Carolina. The New York electors were selected by the state legislature, and there was a dispute broke out between the Senate and the Assembly. This has never happened in New York since then. The Senate wanted to veto over the Assembly's choice. The Assembly didn't want to give the Senate the veto, and the argument was so bitter that New York missed the deadline. So it picked no electors. Of the other 10 states, 3 picked the electors by popular vote. In the other 7, the electors were picked by the state legislators. 2 electors from Virginia didn't make it to the state capitol on the first Wednesday in January, nor did 2 from Maryland. I haven't been able to find out what happened to the Virginians, but one of the Maryland men was blocked by ice in Chesapeake Bay, and the other suffered an attack of the gout. So on the first Wednesday in January of the new year, 69 men met in 10 state capitals and cast the first votes for President of the United States. The most noteworthy thing about this election is that it was unanimous. All 69 votes went for George Washington for president. Now, this was not because these men saw eye to eye on everything. Most of them, like Washington, had supported the new Constitution, but a few of them had not. There also was no unanimity in the choice of the vice president. John Adams would only get 34 votes, and the remaining votes were scattered among 10 other men. And yet, all the votes went to Washington. And this was expected at the time. A Philadelphia newspaper wrote, "It is universally hoped and expected that one more tribute of merited approbation will be given to George Washington, Esquire, by their unanimous suffrages." The second noteworthy thing about this election is how easy it was. Washington made no speeches, he made no appearances, he made no trips. He wrote a few letters to friends who had written letters to him, and they mostly had the tone of course, if I should be chosen, I will serve, but it's quite possible that I will not be chosen. Well, it was not quite possible. He was chosen. The state capitals sent the results of their votes to Congress on the first Wednesday of February, where they were counted. A messenger was sent to Washington at Mount Vernon to tell him what the result was. He came north to New York City, which was then the capital of the country, and he was inaugurated in April of 1789. So tonight I want to talk about three things. How did George Washington get to this position of political dominance? What was politics then in 1789? And then how did he navigate it over the next 8 years of his presidency on into the 1790s? The first question, how he got this political dominance. There are three reasons. And the first one is obvious. It was his military record. Washington is the only president in American history who was commander-in-chief before he was president. He had that title because obviously during the Revolution there was no president, there was no Secretary of War or Defense, there was no executive. The government only consisted of one House of Congress, which did everything, and special business they farmed out to committees of Congress. So Washington was the individual symbol of this revolution and of this new nation. We have to remember how disruptive the revolution was. Today I think we'd say traumatic. We can mistakenly think, well, it was the 18th century, things were more decorous, so the fighting must have been. In some ways that was true. There were certain courtesies that officers on each side generally extended to each other. But this was a long war. It was 8.5 years. It was the longest war we would fight until Vietnam. In some places, like the Carolinas and upstate New York, it was savage. It was guerrilla war. It was conducted by terrorism on both sides. Prisoners were very badly treated, and particularly in certain British prisons. The worst was in New York City. The conditions there were criminal. They would be classified as war crimes now. And Washington had a hard fight of it. He by no means won all his battles. He drove the British out of Boston in the spring of 1776. But then in the summer and the fall, he lost the Battle of Long Island and the Battle of White Plains. At the end of 1776, in the very beginning of the next year, he wins the battles of Trenton and Princeton. But then in the fall of 77, he loses the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. The Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in 78 is a draw. And then Yorktown in October of 1781 is a victory. So if you're scoring it, his record is 4 victories, 4 losses, 1 draw. And if that were baseball, that's like trying to get a wild card slot. But war is not baseball. It's not a playoff. You're not scoring who wins the most victories. What counts are the decisive ones, and particularly if it's the last battle. And those were the ones that Washington won. And everybody likes a winner. Everybody also likes people they've seen, people people they know, people they're familiar with. And the war took Washington across much of this country. It was a big war. It stretched from Quebec to Savannah, and he didn't do that distance, but he fought battles in 5 states. He was in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. He was almost always with his troops. He never gave himself a furlough. During the 8.5 years of the war, he came to Mount Vernon one time for 1 day because he was on the way to Yorktown. So he stopped off here and then he went on to that battle. Congress also asked him to come to meet them in Philadelphia on another point late in the war. But apart from those occasions, he was with his troops. During the winter, when the troops were in camp for the winter, his wife Martha would come from Mount Vernon and spend the time with him. And we know from his soldiers, from memoirs that his soldiers left, that he was a very present figure. There was an occasion early in the war when he came up to Boston, which we were besieging, the British occupied the city, and an altercation broke out between troops from Massachusetts and troops from Virginia. This was almost certainly the first time that any of these men had seen men from another state, and they were strange to each other. They didn't like each other. So words were exchanged, and then snowballs, and then it got to be blows. And Washington was riding by with an aide or someone on his staff, and he saw what was going on. He dismounted. He went into the thick of the fight. He grabbed the 2 largest men on either side of it by the scruff of their necks, and in the words of his fellow officer, he shook them like dogs. Now, all the guys who were there would remember that, and you could be sure that they told all their comrades that later, and that news of this would go through the camp. Another smaller occasion, but I think very telling, is later in the war. And we have this from the memories of a man who was a private. And he's telling the kind of event that happens often in war, which is hurry up and wait. You know, we know the battles that happen, but we forget the battles that almost happen and that don't happen. So the army is in New Jersey. The British have made a move. It looks like maybe they're thinking of attacking. These soldiers have to march to meet it. But then when they get there, the British move away, so that was the end of that. But this soldier remembered that Washington was there. He was looking at the enemy through his spyglass. And then the soldier recalled that he looked through Washington's spyglass also. Now, you have to think, how did he get Washington's spyglass? Well, he must have asked, can I look through your spyglass? And he's 19, 20 years old. He's a cheeky kid, so he asked the commander-in-chief. And what's interesting to me is that Washington is able to give loan an enlisted man his spyglass without losing any of his authority. He knows how to handle, he knows how to deal with the men under him. And when they go home, they tell everyone they know about this man. Now, the rule of thumb now is that anyone in this country can be connected with anyone else by 6 degrees of separation. There's a play of that title. So take someone from Alaska, Hawaii, Maine, but just by 6 degrees of separation, you can supposedly connect that person with any other American. I imagine the degrees of separation for Washington were probably about 2. When you think of the thousands of men who served in the Army, when you think of the states that he passed through, and when you think of all these sometimes not so young men going home and telling what they did during the war, probably it was only 2 degrees of separation. A second reason why Washington is so politically dominant is charisma. Now, the word was not used then. It's a term from theology, and it was only applied to politics in the last century. But the thing has always existed in politics. It has always been a factor. And Washington had it. Thomas Jefferson said that Washington was the greatest horseman of his age. And Jefferson was an excellent horseman himself. And he was a Virginian. And Virginians took horsemanship very seriously. So this is a high and a meaningful compliment. And of course, on horseback, is how most people would see Washington. They're not invited to his dinner table or his functions, but they see him on the battlefield or in camp or passing down the road, and they see him on horseback. When Abigail Adams first met him, he came to Boston, as I said, early in the war. Her husband was in Congress in Philadelphia, so they wrote wonderful letters back and forth. And Abigail writes to John and said, "You have prepared me to be impressed, but I thought the half was not told me. Those lines of Dryden instantly occurred to me. Mark his majestic fabric. He's a temple built by hands divine. His soul's the deity that lodges there, nor is the pile unworthy of the god." I'm not sure John liked this gushing tone. He later said that the reason Washington had become commander-in-chief was that, like Saul of old, he was a head taller than the other Jews. John was short. But Washington was mindful of the figure that he cut. He knew the effect it had, and he always designed his own uniforms. He designed his own uniform in the French and Indian War when he was in his 20s. He designed his own uniform as commander-in-chief during the Revolution, and he did it again in his 60s when he was called out of retirement during a war scare with France. Now, Washington was not an eloquent man. Some of his speeches had a powerful effect, but he was not an orator. He was not Patrick Henry. But he made an effect on people by an even more basic means, which was his appearance. With Washington, the eyes had it. But his military record and his charisma were not the most important reasons for his political dominance. I think the most important reason was his devotion to the political system. He was not coming to politics as an outsider. He came to the presidency as a trusted and respected insider. Washington served for 16 years in the Virginia House of Burgesses before the great colonial crisis of the mid-1770s. He knew the political system of his own colony. His first election, he couldn't attend. Voting then was public. People went to the county seat to vote, and they declared publicly who they were voting for. And Washington was still in service in the French and Indian War. But we do have his correspondence with the man who was, in effect, his campaign manager. And in those days, although it was illegal to treat voters to drinks, it was universally done. Every candidate did this. So we know from these letters what the Washington campaign bought the voters in this first race. There were 28 gallons of rum, 50 gallons of rum punch, 38 gallons of wine, 46 gallons of beer, and 2 gallons of cider. I'm sure it was hard. That's 164 gallons. There were 196 voters, and Washington won. And his only complaint to his campaign manager was that he had not spent enough money on the liquor beforehand. But Washington also understood issues. We don't think of Washington as one of the intellectuals of the founding, one of these polymaths who's read everything, like Jefferson or John Adams or James Madison. But one thing that Washington did read very carefully was the political literature of his day. It started in the 1760s with a controversy in Virginia called the Parsons Cause, and it was a fight about who should pay ministers of the Church of England. Should it be the vestries or the church itself? Obviously, this is an issue of local control. And pamphlets were written about this, and Washington bought them and he read them. And he continued to do this throughout the 1760s and 70s. In 1774, he helped present an important document to Fairfax County. He collaborated on this with his neighbor, George Mason, who lived at Gunston Hall just down the road. George Mason was one of the self-taught intellectuals of the founding era. No formal education, but just a brilliant brilliant man who mastered the political theory of his day. So this was a series of resolves, how we should respond to what we thought of as the ill treatment we were getting from Britain. The second resolve says, the most important and valuable part of the British Constitution is the fundamental principle of the people's being governed by no laws to which they have not given their consent by representatives freely chosen by themselves. Resolution number 5 takes it to Parliament. The claim lately assumed by the British Parliament of making all laws as they think fit to govern the people of these colonies is not only contrary to the first principles of the Constitution, explained in Resolve 2, but is totally incompatible with the natural rights of mankind. This is looking ahead 2 years to the laws of nature and nature's God. The thought is already here. Then, point number 9, resolve number 9, there is a premeditated design formed by the British ministry to introduce an arbitrary government into His Majesty's American dominions. Then the proposal is we should have an economic blockade with Britain, and many resolves discuss that. But then the last one says, resolved that George Washington Esquire and George Broadwater Gentleman be appointed to attend the convention in Williamsburg and present these resolves. So Washington, Mason wrote these resolves, but Washington had collaborated with him on the whole project. Washington took them from Fairfax County to Williamsburg, and then Virginia sent them, again Washington carrying them to the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress, in 1774. So when the Revolution begins, Washington is a well-informed, well-educated patriot. He also knows his place in this system. He knows his place, and to show that, I want to read from a letter that he writes to the governors of New England in January of 1781. Now, he's writing them because there has been a great crisis. The Pennsylvania line has mutinied. This was a unit in the Continental Army. It was one of our best units, one of our longest serving, longest suffering, but they hadn't been paid for 12 months, and so they had mutinied. Here, if at any time, was a moment for extreme measures, for emergency measures. This is how Washington responds to it. He writes to the governors of the New England states, "It is not within the sphere of my duty to make requisitions without the authority of Congress from individual states." Now, what this means is that Congress cannot raise taxes. The only way they can get money is by going to the states and asking for the money. So this is doubly not Washington's authority. It's not his authority to do this at all, and it's not even Congress's authority because Congress has to go to the states. It looks like a short circuit here. But at such a crisis and circumstance as we are, my own heart will acquit me, and Congress and the states whom for the sake of dispatch I address, I am persuaded will excuse me. Excuse him for what? When once for all, I give it decidedly as my opinion. That's what this emergency measure is. He wants to give his opinion. And he says that it's in vain to think an army can be kept together much longer unless immediate and spirited measures are adopted. And then he explains what those are: 3 months' pay, clothe the troops, feed the troops. Then he goes on, I have transmitted to Congress a copy of this letter and have in the most pressing manner requested them to adopt the measure which I have above recommended, or something similar to it. This is not only a request, it's not even a final request. You know, if you do something similar to it, that will be fine too. Then he goes on, and as I will not doubt of their compliance, I have thought proper to give you this previous notice. So what this is at this moment of crisis is a heads up. That's as far as he will go. He will not step beyond his limits any further than that. a Frenchman who served alongside our troops during the Revolution and then went back home and wrote about his experiences here, the Marquis Chastellux. In the next year, 1782, he published his book, and in it there is a sentence about Washington. He says he has served Congress, he has commanded the army for 7 years, and he has served Congress. No more need be said. And that explains Washington's relation to the political system and why people felt they could trust him with yet more power and yet more prominence. So what was politics in the 1780s? It was an Anglo-American system of frequent and sometimes regular elections, and elections that counted for something, because the people who were elected had actual real power. In England, Parliament really controlled everything, and even in American colonial assemblies, the elected assemblies had the power of the purse. Now, Parliament, shortly before Washington was born, had won its final victory in its long struggle to get power from the king. And Winston Churchill described this in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, and it happened at the time of the death of Queen Anne. Queen Anne had no heirs, so the next king, or the next sovereign, had to be her closest Protestant relative. And England sent to Germany for a German prince who becomes George I. So Churchill writes, the sovereign had ceased after 1714 to preside in person over the cabinet, a most significant event, though it was the result of an accident. Queen Anne had always presided over her cabinet meetings at Kensington Palace, but George I could not speak English and had to converse with his ministers in French, or in such dog Latin as they remembered from their days at Eton. So here, finally, Parliament slips from the last bands of royal control. And this is a world of elections and powerful elected officials that Washington inhabits. But the great difference between that world and this is the role of political parties. Parties exist, but they are universally thought to be bad things. They're also commonly called factions, and they are considered sources of dissension and chaos and corruption. And the man who settled America's image of political parties was an English politician, Henry St. John Viscount Bolingbroke. He was born in 1686, died in 1751. He never set foot in America. As far as I know, he never gave America a thought. But his writings about politics were so popular here that I think he could be considered one of our intellectual founding fathers. Now, Bolingbroke was to the manner born. He entered Parliament when he was 21. He entered the cabinet when he was 26. Then in his late 30s, his career blew up at the death of Queen Anne, which was the moment I was just describing. Bolingbroke had put all his hopes on Queen Anne's remaining in power and doing what he wanted her to do, but she dies. He's not nimble enough to make nice with the incoming king. He is exiled to France, where he lives for 7 or 8 years. Finally, they let him back to England, although they won't let him hold office anymore. So he becomes a journalist. He's very good at it. He's a very good writer, sprightly writer, smart, well-spoken. He publishes his own magazine called The Craftsman, and he diagnoses the ills of the English political system. He says that the great problem is political parties. When they take power, they hold power by corruption. They give away jobs to members of Parliament. And the only remedy for this, he says in one of his books called The Patriot King, would be to have a patriotic monarch who, instead of putting himself at the head of one party in order to govern his people, he will put himself at the head of his people in order to govern, or more properly, to subdue all parties. Now, Bolingbroke had very little effect in England because everyone knew he was a hypocrite. He didn't mean any of this. He was only slagging his rivals who held office, and he was hoping they would fall. Maybe he'd get to hold office again. But we in America didn't know him so well, so we were taking him seriously. And he made a great impression on us, and largely because he was explaining, he seemed to explain our problems with our royal masters. Why was England treating us badly? Why didn't they pay attention to us? Well, surely it must be because of political parties and factions who are running the government for their own interest and keeping themselves in power by their corrupt machinations. Everybody in the founding generation owned Bolingbroke's work. George Washington got a complete set of the Craftsman in 1759 when he married Martha Custis and acquired the Custis Library. In 1771, Thomas Jefferson included Bolingbroke on a list of a few only of the best books on politics. And in 1813, an old John Adams wrote that he had read Bolingbroke more than 50 years ago and more than 5 times in my life and once within 5 years past. They read him and they believed him. They all believed, all the founders believed, that political parties were bad things. John Adams again writes, I would quarrel with both parties and with every individual of each before joining either. Thomas Jefferson, I never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party. Such an addiction is the last degradation of a free and moral agent. Finally, James Madison in Federalist 10 writes, by a faction or a party, I understand a number of citizens united by some common impulse of passion or interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Now, Madison knows there will always be such factions, but he defines them as always bad things. They are always adverse to the interests of other citizens or to the community as a whole. And this is what Americans believed as late as the 1780s. And George Washington was elected unanimously. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, the unanimity didn't last. Contention appeared early on in his presidency. And the two reasons were Alexander Hamilton and the French Revolution. Alexander Hamilton was the youngest member of Washington's cabinet. The cabinet in those days only had 3 offices. There was the Secretary of State. This was Thomas Jefferson. He'd been our Minister to France for 5 years. There was the Secretary of War. This was Henry Knox. He'd been Washington's artillery commander during the whole of the Revolution. The youngest and most inexperienced was the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. He was 32 years old. All he'd done is help charter a bank in New York, and he'd worked for a merchant house when he was a boy back in the Caribbean where he came from. He hadn't been Washington's first choice. That was Robert Morris, the man who'd been the chief financier during the Revolution, the richest man in the United States. But Morris was tired of public service. He wanted to make money, so he recommended Hamilton, told Washington that Hamilton was damn sharp. Washington knew that already, having had him on his staff during the war. So Hamilton got the job. And the great problem that he had to deal with was our debt from the Revolution. Wars cost money, and America was crushed by debts after its victory. We were so badly off that our debt was trading in Europe at 1/4 to 1/3 of its face value. It was at the level of junk. So Hamilton embarked on a fiscal program, which by the time he retires in 1795, our debt is trading in Europe at 110% of its face value. European money men are paying a small premium to hold it. That's because Hamilton has made it as good as gold. But there were several glitches along the way, one of them at the very beginning. Hamilton had trouble getting his first plans through Congress because of an issue called assumption. And this was the notion that the United States would assume the debts of all 13 states, because not only had the United States gone into debt, all the states themselves had gone into debt to help fight the Revolutionary War. Some of them were very badly off. Massachusetts, South Carolina in particular. Massachusetts' efforts to pay its debts, they tried to pay them with a land tax, and that caused a farmers' revolt called Shays' Rebellion. So Hamilton said that all these debts should be put in one pot and the federal government should pay them all. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, some states had already paid off all their debts, so they didn't like the notion of paying for the deadbeats. But Hamilton's point of view was this was a common struggle. It was not each state fighting for its own independence. It was all of them fighting for the independence of all. So therefore, we all ought to pay these debts. And what happened next, we know from Thomas Jefferson, who kept a diary of events, interesting events during the Washington administration. And Jefferson writes that sometime in the spring of 1790, the capital is still in New York City, he runs into Hamilton outside Washington's house, which was then on Lower Broadway. And Hamilton was uncharacteristically haggard and unkempt. Hamilton was, like many parvenus, he was a very careful dresser. So Jefferson asked him what was the problem. Hamilton said, I can't get assumption through Congress. If that doesn't pass, the whole thing falls to the ground. So Jefferson said, well, let me have a dinner at my house. Let me invite James Madison, Representative James Madison of Virginia, who's leading the resistance to this, and we'll see what can be worked out. Now, Madison was a former friend and ally of Hamilton's. He was Jefferson's best friend. So the three of them get together, and then the result, according to Jefferson, is that Madison won't vote for assumption himself, but he pledges that there will be enough votes to pass it. And in return, Hamilton will make sure that the capital of the country moves first from New York to Philadelphia for 10 years, and then from Philadelphia to the Potomac, to a site not yet developed. Jefferson leaves out one detail of the deal, which was that Virginia was to get a better deal on its Revolutionary War debts. Jefferson conceals that. But the other thing he also leaves out is George Washington. Where is George Washington, the president, in all of this? And certainly, Washington very much wanted the capital on the Potomac. He had a lifelong vision of the Potomac as the route into the American West. If only you could put locks on the Potomac, you could navigate it, and with a portage, you could hook up to rivers that flowed into the Ohio, and the Potomac would be the great artery into the interior of the continent, and Alexandria would become a great port. This never happened, but this was a lifelong preoccupation of Washington's. But even more, I think, important than this is that Washington is trusting his cabinet. He's trusting the people that he's picked to do their job. He knows that Hamilton is damn sharp. He trusts Thomas Jefferson. He's made him Secretary of State. So if they can make an arrangement to make this work and to get our debt up from junk to something better, well, let them do it. So I think this is an example of wise, hands-off politics on the part of the president. The French Revolution was the other great disruptive force in our politics. And you always have to remember, when you're reading about the early republic, two dates. Washington is inaugurated April 1789. The Bastille falls in July. So the first 25 years of Americans' history under the Constitution takes place in the shadow of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that follow, all the way to Waterloo. The War of 1812 is part of those wars. But at first, the French Revolution is greeted with joy in America. France was our ally. It helped us win our independence from England. Surely they can enjoy the same liberties that we do. When Jefferson was ending his tenure as our minister to France, he helped Lafayette write the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a famous French statement of rights in their first post-revolutionary constitution. And then when the revolution, the French Revolution, becomes more turbulent, more chaotic than ours, many Americans are still fond of it, still in favor of it. Jefferson writes a letter in January of 1781. He writes it to a young diplomat who's a protege of his, a man named William Short. And he's talking about some of the executions that have occurred in Paris. Jefferson says the liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest. Rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated, were there but an Adam and an Eve left in every country, and left free, it would be better than it now is. So all of this comes to a head in April of 1793 when France sends a new minister to the United States. His name is Charles Edmond Genet. And the French party he belongs to is called the Girondins because many of them are from a region known as the Gironde. The Girondins were the Trotskyites of the French Revolution. They believed in worldwide revolution. The Jacobins who would succeed and execute them all were the Stalinists of the revolution. They believed in revolution in one country. They were both equally bloodthirsty and tyrannical. So Genet comes to America. He's supposed to land in Philadelphia, but he's blown off course and he lands in Charleston. And it takes him 28 days to get to the Capitol to present his credentials, and it's like a triumphal tour. One journalist wrote, "It is beyond the power of figures or words to express the hugs and kisses that were lavished on him. Very few parts, if any, of the citizen's body escaped a salute." Genet himself wrote, "I live in the midst of perpetual fêtes." Now, what he wanted out of the United States was rather a lot. He wanted us to pay off our war debts ahead of time in a lump sum. He wanted to be able to organize an invasion of Louisiana from the western United States because it was then owned by Spain, which at that moment was an enemy of France. And he also wanted to be able to commission privateers in American ports. These would be French ships, in effect, that would go out, capture British ships, and bring them back and make money from them. Genet had to deal, the point man for dealing with him, of course, is the Secretary of State. And Thomas Jefferson is torn. He does his duty, he does the right thing. He tells Genet, we can't pay off the money ahead of time. We can't let you invade Louisiana from our territory. And he says you can't outfit privateers. And he's rather eloquent on this point. He says, "For our citizens to commit murder and depredations on the members of nations at peace with us was as much against the laws of the land as to murder or rob its own citizens." But at the same time, he's sympathetic to Genet because Genet represents the French Revolution and he thinks the same principles that he himself holds. He writes privately to a friend about how affectionate Genet is. And he also gives Genet's briefings on who in America likes France and who doesn't like France. In other words, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So the crisis comes in July when Genet outfits a privateer right in Philadelphia, in the nation's capital. This is a major provocation. Now, Washington happens to be at Mount Vernon. Unlike his time as commander-in-chief, he did take some vacation, so he is out of town. And the cabinet is left to discuss this issue. The ship has not yet sailed, but Genet has already readied it for combat. Alexander Hamilton wants to blow it out of the water with cannon on the shore. Jefferson says, no. Genet's look and gesture have assured me that the ship will not sail. So then Washington comes back from Mount Vernon, and he finds on his desk a bundle of papers marked "Instant Attention." These are papers from Jefferson describing everything that was going on. But Jefferson himself is not there. Washington writes him a letter. "After I had read the papers put into my hands by you requiring instant attention, and before a messenger could reach your office, you had left town. Circumstances press for decision, and as you have had time to consider them, upon me they come unexpected. I wish to know your opinion on them. Jefferson writes back, TJ has had a fever the last 2 nights. Nothing but absolute inability will prevent his being in town early tomorrow morning. Now, I find that all historians accept this story, the notion that Jefferson had a fever. You know, maybe he did, but I think he also didn't want to face the music that here his friend was outfitting this privateer right in the nation's capital. So back he comes, and the question is now, we have to ask for Genet's recall. He's not behaving like an ambassador should, but should we do it publicly? Should we make an issue of it, or should we do it privately through diplomatic channels? Hamilton wants to make an issue of it. He wants to embarrass Genet in revolutionary France, and he actually leaks news of what Genet is up to the newspapers. Jefferson wants to do it diplomatically, and Washington agrees with him because he doesn't want to have a fight with France. He wants to get this guy out of here, but he doesn't want to bring our relations with France to a boil. So that's the decision they make. Now Jefferson comes up with a new wrinkle. He tells Washington that he wants to retire to scenes of greater tranquility. This would be a terrible thing. If the Secretary of State, in the midst of this foreign policy crisis, quits the administration, and we know that the Secretary of State is pro-French, this will seem like a tilt away from France. It will make this whole issue much more inflamed. It will make it an issue of domestic politics. So now Washington goes out to Jefferson's house. He calls on Jefferson. They have a long conversation, very Virginian, very polite. Nothing is said, but everything is understood. Washington tells Jefferson that he believes his motives are perfectly pure. Jefferson, of course, says that that's what they are. And Jefferson agrees to stay till December, when the crisis is past, and then when he leaves, it will not do damage. So this is an example of Washington taking a very active role. Now, the principle would be described by Michael Corleone of keeping your friends close but your enemies closer. Also, Lyndon Johnson said it was better to have J. Edgar Hoover in the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. But these are very old maneuvers in politics, and we can see Washington mastering them in a different set of circumstances. He behaves differently, but equally effectively. None of these issues would go away. They would continue throughout his second term in office. Hamilton's tax policies would produce an insurrection in western Pennsylvania called the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington would have to lead an army, or have to send an army 5 times larger than the army he took across the Delaware for the Battle of Trenton. He took it very seriously indeed. And then foreign policy would continue to be inflamed. A treaty that John Jay negotiates with England causes protests, almost riots in American cities because it's seen as anti-French, almost fails to pass the Senate. It does pass the Senate, and it's actually a pretty good treaty, and people are happy with it. But then, in September of 1796, Washington makes the decision that he didn't make in 1789 or in 1793. He says that he will not serve. And his announcement of this is, of course, the farewell address, which he has published in a Philadelphia newspaper in September. And there he touches on the issues that have been roiling his administration. He touches on the financial issues. Cherish public credit. By vigorous exertions in time of peace, discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned. He also talks about foreign policy. The nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. 'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. We may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. But then he also spends time on political parties. And here he says, "Let me now warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of party. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy." So this is still Bolingbroke for one more last hurrah. But now the sources of parties are not noblemen conspiring together in factions. These are the people themselves produce parties. And Washington warns us to have nothing to do with it. We wouldn't take that warning. We'd already not taken it. Political parties have already come into being, and that will be the subject of my next lecture in October. Thank you. I see we have two microphones, one in either aisle, so a signal to the gentleman and the lady who hold them if you want to ask a question. Or I guess I've answered all questions. That's good too. Yes.
I have a question about factions and disagreements between strong intellectuals and people who have strong personalities. Like in Washington today, people have disagreements, and you think you can never settle them. You always have to be on the opposite side. But if you can go into a little bit about Jefferson and Adams and just a little bit of that acrimony and how they ended up doing big things, even though they had strong disagreements about the future of the republic.
Well, they did do big things, and sometimes they were able to come to arrangements, as they did over the Assumption, and that was a deal. I mean, Jefferson and Madison still didn't like it, but they figured, well, we can get something that we do like. It's also important, so let's do that. But they never agreed. I mean, they never made nice. Certainly not Jefferson and Madison with Hamilton. Certainly not Hamilton and Adams. I mean, after Hamilton dies early, he's shot and killed by the vice president. And that's something we have to remember, that the political temper in the 1790s and the early 1800s was much worse than it is now. If they came back now, they'd say, congratulations, you've really calmed everything down. It's less. When Vice President Cheney shot that man, it was an accident, and he lived. But Vice President Burr deliberately shot and killed the Treasury Secretary. Now, that was politics then. After Hamilton dies, Jefferson and Madison, Madison particularly, does say some nice things about him years later. Adams never does. Adams hates him for the rest of his days, and this hatred is carried on by his son, John Quincy Adams, who is also president. So the passions that were excited, and I think one reason they were worse is that it was all new. It was all brand new, and they knew that, well, the president serves a term of 4 years, and the congressmen serve for 2, and the senators for 6, and there are elections. But they didn't really believe in their bones that if you lost, you'd get another shot. And we do believe that now. We do believe in the turning wheel and the seesaw that goes up and down. But Jefferson really thought that Hamilton was a British agent and a monarchist. And Hamilton seems to have thought that Jefferson would set up guillotines. I think it's possible that he was joking about it, because he ended one letter to a friend of his saying, the stakes in this election are, order, property, and of course heads. And I think Hamilton had a sort of mordant streak of humor, so maybe he's not 100% serious. But, people, these great men really did believe the worst of each other. And it's a sobering thing. And it was, partly a tribute to their great talents, also to luck and good fortune, that the country not only got through external challenges, but was able to surmount its own internal stresses and strains. Yes?
This may be a topic that you're going to get to next time, but one of the things that has always struck me is that with Washington's opposition to political parties, it's never seemed to me that there was an alternative vision of how what the process was going to be. You were going to select candidates, particularly for the highest office, and that's always seemed to me to be certainly an omission in his thinking. Do you have any thoughts on what he would have envisioned?
Well, I think it's an omission in everybody's thinking initially, and in a way, his election and re-election sort of puts off the problem, because everybody can say, well, of course it has to be him. So then you don't have to think any deeper than that. As we know, Washington got sick twice during his first term, and if suppose he'd been carried off by one of those ailments, and then they would have had to, deal with this right away. But, and certainly the spirit of Washington, certainly the original notion of the Electoral College was that it would be almost a collegial group. I mean, each one only meets one time, but there would be a number of candidates. Maybe no one after Washington would get a majority, so there'd be choosing among them, and a kind of deliberative process. But that simply doesn't happen. The founding fathers are taken by surprise by the party system that they themselves create, and I will get into that in the next lecture. Yes, sir. Oops.
In The Great Divide, Mr. Fleming blames Thomas Jefferson totally for the division between he and Washington. You seem to indicate that that may not be quite so dominant a factor, that these two men who had, both Virginians, had been close, no longer could be such. Why did they suddenly come apart?
Well, a big factor, I think, is military service. Of course, Jefferson serves his country during the Revolution, but he does it as a politician, as governor of Virginia, in the Continental Congress. Washington is on the firing line, and that colors the views of a lot of people who share that experience. Hamilton was also in the Army, John Marshall was in the Army. I mean, not everybody. James Monroe was in the Army, and he was a great ally of Jefferson and Madison. But certainly the military experience could dispose you to think that, the way we started doing things was very wrong. We really had to have some tightening up of the finances, particularly, or we just can't have an army for any crisis. And there's also a temperamental divide. Jefferson is a hopeful man. I mean, Joseph Ellison, he had this great point, I think it was in American Sphinx. He said the first entry in Jefferson's diary is that the peas have come up, which is like it's the spring of whatever year it is. It's the peas have come up. And that's sort of Jefferson, the peas are always coming up. And in a way that's his great political strength. That he believes that the people ultimately will do the right thing. Now that means they'll agree with him, of course. And on the occasions, the many occasions when they don't, he's quite dismayed. He doesn't know what to make of it. But, his hopefulness just keeps coming back. And Washington has a somewhat darker view. And maybe that's also partly his experience. I mean, he's in the French and Indian War in his 20s. And then he must feel like he's carrying this whole war on his shoulder for 8.5 years. And, this letter that I read you to Congress about, please could we have 3 months pay and some clothes and food? I mean, he writes like several hundred letters like that. If you were from Mars and all you knew about the revolution was Washington's letters to Congress, you would think that the cause was constantly about to fail. And it sort of constantly was. He wasn't making it up, but, he just saw really tough stuff, really bad stuff over and over again. And I think this shaped both of them. So Virginians, though they were, planters, though they were, there is this a fundamental personal difference. Yes, gentleman in the front row.
I've always been amazed by the degree of duplicity that Jefferson sometimes did in terms of Washington's policies and kind of actively undercutting them and so forth, and that I assume Washington knew that and kind of tolerated it. And can you comment a little bit more about that? I mean, you sort of touched upon it in the last gentleman's question, but the degree of it has always shocked me that it was at that level of duplicity, I guess would be the best word.
Well, the phrase I tried to explain it with in Founding Father was that Jefferson had the deep deviousness that is given only to the pure in heart. Because if you said, well, you've deceived that person, I mean, he would be shocked by that. He would be truly, sincerely shocked. And part of it is, again, it's his personality. Jefferson hates conflict on a personal level. He hates it. He wrote a famous letter of advice, I think, to one of his nephews. And one of his points, he had 10 points of this. And one of them was always take things by the smooth handle. Always take things by the smooth handle. Jefferson wants, he loves dinners. He loves hosting dinners. He doesn't want wrangles and contention. So he often, he'll talk to someone and give the impression that he agrees with them, or that, somewhat agrees with them. And then when he turns around and does something else, and then people say, oh, he's a hypocrite, he deceived me, he lied to me. Well, partly it was just like, let me get through this meeting and, not get bent out of shape and get him bent out of shape. Let's just try and be smooth here. So that's part of it. And he also thinks he can never bring himself to admit that Washington really does disagree with him. That would be too, I think, too alarming. So it always has to be, well, Hamilton must be fooling him. Isn't it a shame, this great man? I mean, and he writes a letter that actually became public and did him a lot of damage to an Italian friend of his. He said, you would not believe the Samsons that have been shorn by the harlots of England. So he's comparing Washington to Samson. The harlots of England were Hamilton and his pals. Now that's not very respectful to Washington, but that preserves his notion, well, he's good. I mean, his heart is in the right place, his heart is pure, but he doesn't have enough information. The king has bad ministers. We do it with our parents, right? We come up with excuses. So these little dramas go on in the Washington cabinet because he's the father of his country. Any more questions?
We'll take one more.
Yes, one more. Yes, the gentleman in the middle.
Follow up on that. I was under the impression that Washington actually came in contact with that letter.
Well, yes, it was public. It got published in 1797, I believe, in this country. If it had been published before the election of 1796, Jefferson might not have made it as vice president. I mean, it caused, kind of a shock. So,
But that must
yes,
have had a lot to do with the divisiveness.
Pardon?
That must have had a lot to do with the divisiveness, having him writing.
The divisiveness had already happened.
Okay.
That was kind of the bad icing on the cake. But we'll get into that much more in October, so thank you all for your attention.